Washington, D.C., 1954. Three men sit around the table, designing a military operation. This makes sense, as two of them are former soldiers. The first is President Dwight Eisenhower, former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe and Commander of NATO. This is his first position in civilian leadership, but he is a military man who likes military solutions. The second man is Joseph May Swing, a retired general who Eisenhower appointed as the head of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. He commanded paratroopers during the invasion of the Philippines, and as a lieutenant, helped conduct the punitive expedition into Mexico hunting Pancho Villa. And the third man is Harlan Carter, chief of the Border Patrol. He'd followed his father into the job and risen through the ranks as a hardliner. At the age of 17, he'd shot and killed a 15-year-old Hispanic boy in cold blood after suspecting, without evidence, that the kid had stolen his family's car. But it's Carter, the only one who'd never served in the armed forces, who is proposing using the military within American borders. He proposed a vast operation where the U.S. military will assist INS in sweeping factories, farms, and kitchens for undocumented immigrants, then deport them immediately via trains, boats, and plane flights. Eisenhower approves the raids, but denies Carter the use of the military as unconstitutional. Instead, Swing will use INS assets in a military fashion, in a sweeping summer offensive targeted at the American homeland. And they'll call it Operation Hey everyone, IRL Matt here. Sorry for the interruption, but I'm sure that bleep you just heard set off a few alarm bells, as that's something that we don't normally do on our show, and I wanted to talk about it for a minute. So our last episode in this series recently got demonetized by YouTube for a while because we used the official name of said abhorrently named United States operation. This caused a rather large hit to the video's ability to reach a larger audience and share this often underrepresented history with more people. Now, in the episode you're about to watch, which was completed before episode 2 aired, we dive further into this stain on our country's legacy and use its official US government name throughout. On the philosophical side, this is because we believe if you constantly sanitize the awful or just plain uncomfortable bits of history, even the most thoughtful discussions begin to lose context, and we lose opportunities for all of us to learn from our collective mistakes and do better in the future. However, sadly, on the studio side of things, with YouTube's inability to have a nuanced pre-screening system, we can't risk YouTube demonetizing this video and burying the series further, hence the changes to the episode you're about to see. With all that said, should you want it, the uncensored version is available over on Nebula. And I know that it's odd to be saying something like, go hear the official government slur uncensored here, but like everything in history, the fuller a picture of our shared past you receive, even a terrible one, the more context is available for you to learn from. As always, thank you so much for your support, and back to the episode. Last episode, we discussed how migration turned into a national security issue, as Cold War fears of subversion and infiltration helped get national security hawks in Congress on board with anti-immigrant rhetoric. And in Operation, Eisenhower tried to meet this supposed national security problem with a national security response. However, it was not the tactics that were new. Back in 1950, Border Patrol operating in southern Texas began employing a new strategy that used a mobile strike force of 12 agents operating with a complement of automobiles, a truck, an airplane, and 2 buses. They'd raid a field, business, or event, sweep up everyone who didn't have papers, and then load them onto a bus at gunpoint that would take them across the border. Then Swing and Carter agreed to roll out these tactics nationwide. Their teams of Border Patrol and INS would target immigrant hotspots across the country, such as California, Texas, and Chicago. And they set up checkpoints inland from the southern border to catch any migrants who'd made it through the beefed-up border security. They'd also expand the bus lift, train lift, and airlift tactics that INS had already pioneered, busing migrants to the border, where Mexican Border Patrol took charge of them. Flights taking deportees to the interior of Mexico, chartered from private airlines who jockeyed for the lucrative government contracts, resumed again after ceasing due to lack of funds in 1953. And finally, they'd added what would become an infamous boat lift program, operating from Port Isabel, Texas to Veracruz, Mexico. It would load deportees in front of families playing on the beach in Port Isabel, packing in around 2,000 deportees per month. The program was announced to great fanfare, lauded in the press under its official name. That term originated in Texas during the early Bracero program, when from 1942 to 1947, the state of Texas opted out of the initiative because growers felt the 30 cents an hour wage was too high, and instead welcomed undocumented migrants who supposedly swam across the Rio Grande to get hired, quote, while their backs were still wet. Today, the term is solidly considered a slur, but back then, it was regularly used in headlines. And when Operation was announced, there was very little pushback. Cold Warrior politicians liked that it was tough on national security. Labor organizations were pleased that there was action on what they considered a threat to their economic interests. And an early series of articles where the government advertised the excellent conditions aboard flights, they made a big deal about giving the deportees boxed lunches, made the whole thing seem humane. Which was important, since Supreme Court decisions during the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act had emphasized that deportation was a civil proceeding, not a form of punishment. Even Hispanic veterans organizations came out in favor of the operation. After all, people should just take the legal path if they wanted to come here, right? Well, that changed pretty fast. First, the raids hit California, and it started to become clear just how many people were getting swept up, including how many citizens or U.S. citizen spouses and children were being taken. Similarly, Hispanic veteran and labor organizations started to get reports of their members being stopped and treated like criminal aliens, forced to show papers, or even deported in error or regardless of their visa status. Others lost family members, so they began to reverse course on the program and lodged protests against it. Then in Texas, growers complained to newspapers that the, quote, poor were terrified of the government agents, saying that they didn't know why the government had to persecute Mexicans who were just wanting to work. In fact, growers began hiring armed guards that had standoffs with INS agents while their workforce hid. But it was in Chicago that the biggest resistance coalesced. Chicago was the last place hit, and by that time, public backlash had begun to grow. Similarly, the Hispanic community was a bit more spread out and far more integrated into the city's service industry, meaning that when the raids happened, there was a greater sense that it was your neighbor or barber being taken at gunpoint. Citizens were more likely to hide, warn, or cover for those they knew when INS showed up. There was also, by then, a greater sense that by forcing a formal deportation hearing, rather than acquiescing to voluntary return, they could stymie the operation in the courts. But the most horrifying stories came from deportees, non-citizens and citizens alike, who were swept up in the raids. Though there was some attempt to send deportees to the region that they hailed from, the INS was frequently careless. It wasn't unusual for men, women, and children to be sent to cities they were totally unfamiliar with, including some who did not speak Spanish. And because they were detained at random times, these people often had only the clothes on their backs and what money they had in their pockets. That is, if the American or Mexican Border Patrol agents didn't shake them down during the trip, which some did officially, since detainees were supposed to pay for their own transport if they had funds, while others were simply robbed. And despite the headlines about boxed lunches, many were dropped off in unfamiliar cities without food, water, housing, or money. Others were famously let off in the middle of nowhere. In one incident, 88 deportees died of sunstroke when buses let them off in the middle of the desert, forcing the Red Cross to intervene. But it was the boat lift that became the most controversial. The U.S. government hired a Mexican shipping company for the effort, reasoning that it was cheaper because Mexican maritime laws, safety standards, and passenger requirements were far looser. 2 ships, the SS Emancipacion and the SS Mercurio, were used. Not the passenger decks, though. Deportees would live between the decks, in the cargo area. Deportees were packed in there with few modifications amid conditions that a later congressional investigation would compare to the Atlantic slave ships. The rough seas meant that most spent the journey extremely seasick, with the few toilets overflowing. The one mercy was that the deck was air-conditioned. Not for migrants, though. See, these ships also carried bananas north and migrants south. They wanted to make sure the bananas arrived fresh. Conditions aboard the ships became so infamous in Mexico that there was an outcry in the local press that leaked over to the United States, particularly after an incident where a group of deportees jumped overboard and tried to swim to shore at a Mexican port where they had family. While a few made it, 4 others drowned or were attacked by sharks. In response to the public outcry, an INS official inspected the ship and, in a press conference, told reporters that while the conditions would offend an American passenger, they were, quote, sufficient for. He went on to claim that lower-class Mexicans were unfamiliar with toilets. The public outcry helped ensure that Operation only lasted a few months, with most mass actions winding down by the fall. But, here is the thing. After all this horror, after the people shipped like cargo, eaten by sharks, left in the desert, it turned out that the number of people deported during Operation was actually less than the previous year. See, Commissioner Swing claimed that during 1954, the Border Patrol apprehended 1,089,583 people due to the summer campaign. But those numbers were from the financial year of 1954, that ended on June 30th, only 2 weeks into the operation. In reality, most of the apprehensions from the campaign were included in the 1955 numbers, which were 254,096 apprehensions, meaning that the operation expelled perhaps 300,000 people, many of whom likely came back. So why all this misery? Well, it was for the cameras. One major feature of Operation, from the eye-catching name to the high-profile appointment of Swing to the reporters that followed the raids, was that it was trying to get attention. This was essentially a publicity campaign, subjecting migrants to awful conditions and giving the press access to them so they could capture that misery and disseminate it to the public as a strategy to frighten migrants and show the American public that something was being done. And they claimed it worked, as far as they could measure. For the rest of the 1950s, illegal entries went drastically down, which has triggered at least one 2014 article about Operation titled, "How President Eisenhower Solved Illegal Immigration," which is just so obviously wrong on its face because border enforcement is larger than ever. But Operation was only one side of the equation. The other side was that around the time of the program, the U.S. government was expanding avenues for legal migration. In 1950, the Bracero program offered 67,000 visas per year. By 1956, it had been raised to 445,000. Meanwhile, there was no cap on permanent residency. So for those who wanted to stay or bring over family, channels for legal migration existed. Employers could and did sponsor braceros for permanent residency, which raised the number of official migrants from 9,600 in 1952 to 65,000 in 1956. So this was a bit of a carrot and stick approach. The naked inhumanity of Operation was supposed to drive anyone thinking about crossing into the expanded and improved official channels, which is part of why, by the end of the 1950s, border apprehensions had dropped to just 30,000 per year, and the border situation was deemed solved. This is, of course, not to say that the Bracero program was great. The supposed economic lift to Mexico never came. It was explicitly an attempt to undercut agricultural unions, and braceros frequently reported underpayment, wage theft, substandard housing, and unreasonable work demands. By inviting marginalized people into the U.S., paying them less than American workers, and giving an employer total power over their visa status, it was creating a system rife for abuse. In fact, the operation was partially targeting these abuses. Farmers in South Texas were the worst offenders in abusing braceros, and Swing actually threatened them with constant raids if they did not start complying with program requirements. But as the civil rights movement gained steam, the Bracero program came under heavy fire from liberals in Congress, who cast its low pay and loose labor standards as inherently racist. Both politicians and commentators compared it to slavery, with the comedy songwriter Tom Lehrer lampooning a California Republican as arguing that, quote, "Even back in Egypt, the pharaohs had to import Hebrew braceros." As a result of this increased scrutiny, the Bracero program ended in 1965. But the results of Operation echoed on. During later border scares of the 1970s forward, the first solution was always to further fund enforcement and militarize the border, a situation that became self-perpetuating, because more enforcement always leads to more apprehensions, which made the problem look statistically worse. Alternatively, lower apprehensions could be spun by an opposition party as inaction on the border. So the border became increasingly militarized, leading to two patterns. First, while most illegal crossings previously happened in the vicinity of urban areas, now people were driven to much more dangerous crossing points in the desert or wilderness. This increasingly necessitated paying people smugglers or guides, making the cost of entry steeper financially as well. Second, once inside, the increased danger and cost of the crossing meant that it interrupted the circular migration pattern of working in the US, then returning to Mexico. Meaning you had more undocumented people staying in the United States, even if they had not planned to, since they often didn't want to risk crossing again, getting caught, and shipped somewhere random hundreds of miles away from where they were from in Mexico. So in summation, immigration is, to put it mildly, a complicated issue. And what we would like you to take away from this series is that it's an issue that doesn't stand still. What history can teach us from looking at this issue, even solely dealing with Mexican migration from the 1930s to the 1960s, is that the situation changed by the decade due to evolving economic, political, national security, and cultural factors. And a complicated, changing issue needs equally well thought out policies that are willing to change and adapt to meet new needs. There is no permanent solution. Though at this point, we do have decades of evidence that harsher enforcement doesn't eliminate the problem so much as change it. Even something like Operation, which is considered an inhumane black mark today, still came in tandem with expansion of legal migration. It's a topic that needs to be approached with nuance and humanity, with a good faith effort to understand the problem and commit to consistency in trying to solve it, aka the opposite of what the current administration is doing right now. Because throughout the period we've shown, and let's be real, to the present, it seems that the only constant is the United States welcoming immigrant laborers when it needs them, whether they entered legally or not, then changing its mind and initiating harsh crackdowns on those same people when it is convenient for a narrative. So I guess the last thing that I just want to say here is, if you are asking people to play by the rules, seems like a pretty fair and good idea that the referee might have to play by those rules too. Because if our leaders only follow the laws and policies when it suits their interests, history does have a rather un-American name for that: dictators. And while our show will be covering a few patron-chosen tyrants in the coming months, you can actually learn more about some of the most insane and eccentric modern rulers right now in Real Life Lore's new exclusive series, Mad Kings. Their episode last month was a fascinating look at the Mad Prince of Iraq, Uday Hussein. Yeah, you know, that guy's kid. But the episode that dropped a few days ago is a deep dive into the monstrous life of Idi Amin, the third president of Uganda, who is considered one of the most brutal despots of the modern world. It covers both his litany of abuses of power, like feeding thousands of his victims to crocodiles in the Nile, to this dude challenging Tanzania's president to a boxing match to settle a war that he started. Joseph and his team crushed it, and the only place you can see it is over on Nebula. You know, that streaming service a bunch of my creator friends and I helped build. Nebula is a place that we at Extra History are extremely thankful for, because it's an independent platform and is never beholden to large media organizations or political policies that might try to influence the history that we talk about and the shows we make. No idea why I'd be worried about that these days. And not for nothing, it's also a place where every show is made by a thoughtful human creator and is free from the onslaught of AI slop that seems to be invading YouTube lately. Plus, on Nebula, you can watch thousands of creative, thought-provoking, and just plain fun videos from over 200 of your favorite creators early and all ad-free. That, of course, includes our huge back catalog of over 1,000 extra history, extra mythology, extra credits, and so you haven't read episodes. So if you want access to all of this at a really good discount, you can use our link, go.nebula.tv/extrahistory, or scan the QR code here or click the link in the description to get 40% off. That's just $36 a year, aka $3 a month with an annual plan. But This 40% also works on lifetime memberships. So while the lifetime price of Nebula recently rose to $500, as of the time of this recording, you can still use our code and pick one up for $300. And any way you slice it, a Nebula subscription using our code directly helps our channel out a ton, so thank you so much in advance. So again, get access to Mad Kings and Nebula by clicking or scanning here, or stay on the YouTube machine and check out our next video here that sadly will still have ads, you know the drill by now. Huzzah, friends! Ziliad's Architectures, Lotus Wolf, Joseph Blame, Hunter Z, Dominic Valenciana, Arls Posting, and Angelo Valenciana are truly the best among us as legendary patrons.